none other than the Tucker Carlson and Putin interview.
Yeah, so this came out of nowhere. Tucker Carlson, a well-known, what do we call him? A personality, journalist? I don't even know, in the US, but he's pretty well known over there for his social commentary. And it turns out that he secured the interview of the century. Century might be a bit of a stretch, but with Vladimir Putin. And I think there was a lot of outcry, may not be the word, but a lot of surprise when this was initially announced, much to the fanfare of the Western media, because I think Vladimir Putin hasn't been interviewed by a Western media outlet in a long while, right? Mm-hmm. So there was a lot of fanfare pertaining to that. It got released. It's actually out on YouTube at the moment, and as at now, it is closing to 17 million views. So this thing is like it is getting viewed at an enormous rate, and that doesn't even count the fact that when it initially got released, it was only released in X. So that was one of the main. So Elon Musk and Tucker Carlson have a kind of synergy going on, right? So where he releases a lot of his content via Tucker Carlson has his own site, and this was initially released on X2, and then I think later on Tucker Carlson released it on his YouTube channel. All which is to say that who knows how many millions of views that this thing has actually kind of got at the moment, right? So interestingly enough, this is a very long interview, right?
2 hours?
It's over 2 hours and 7 minutes, right? So I watched it in all of its glory, and I can tell you it
over multiple viewings.
Over multiple views. And, unless you're in the space, it really does require a lot of attentive listening, right? But it's fascinating. Let me set the theater of actually the optics of this, right? So Tucker Carlson and Vladimir Putin are sitting in what I can only describe as the Russian White House. It's beautiful, it's opulent, it's got like all the trimmings and all that. And for 2 hours, these two are sitting and chatting back to back. So, I mean, it's not like I've seen a lot of Putin interviews, but he's with this headset, which I can only assume while Tucker is asking him questions in English. So he clearly doesn't understand English. I mean, like maybe in an interview setting like that.
It's the same as what they did with Letterman and Zelensky.
Okay. So I think there's no doubt that they understand English, but in a setting of like an interview that probably advanced and nuanced, you probably want like someone directing it real time, right?
Yeah.
So that's happening, and
without interrupting the flow of like the conversation and stuff.
And what's fascinating in the actual interview is obviously this is replayed. It's not live that we're watching it in, but like I was chatting to you after I finally completed it. After a while, when you watch an interview there, you know that he is talking in Russian because the edit is so well done, you kind of think that the person that's translating is Putin. Like if you listen,
the dub is coming into full effect.
And in fact, the dub was so well done that like quite a bit of the comments were just commandeering how well the dub was. Congratulations, bravo to the guy that was just doing his job. But anyway, I thought that was pretty interesting. But so it starts off, and this is where, before the interview starts off, Tucker Carlson cuts a camera and just gives basically an intro before the interview and says that the first 30 to 40 minutes of this interview will be Putin rambling, all right? Like he sets the tone, and I think because he knows
much like what he used to do on his own TV show, right?
because what he knows is that like for a lot of people that are coming there, and obviously with a very highly American audience that's going to watch this, the whole world is going to watch this. They know that they're here specifically to ask about, they're hoping that Tucker is going to ask really probing questions pertaining to the Russian invasion of Ukraine, right? Mm-hmm. So that is, in essence, the first question that Tucker asks, albeit in a very quite nuanced sort of way, right? And what follows is a 30 to 40 minute rant, diatribe, whatever you want to call it. History lesson, which basically articulates and outlines the context of, and I'm probably going to get it wrong, but like it was very challenging for me to kind of follow it. I had to replay it a couple of times. But
what's the Cliff Notes? Yeah.
The Cliff Notes is it sets the context of the justification that Putin felt that there's obviously, synergies is the wrong word, an association between the Ukraine as well as Russia, right? And through the whole historical context, he's able to progressively articulate and set the context that there is a level of justification here that goes well beyond the elements of NATO and before America kind of came in, right? Yeah. So various times throughout this passage of the interview, you see Tucker trying to interject and cut in. And again, we had the conversation after I finished it. It's very hard to understand if the translations, I mean, I'm not Russian and I don't have any Russian friends, were exactly what Putin said, but he was able, and I've listened to a lot of podcasts and reactions after this, that this is a Putin tactic, right? So the guy is obviously very well trained in public speaking. He's done this a couple of times. Depending on who you speak to, there's a lot of propaganda being used, and he's very articulate in deflecting really harsh questions in a way that makes it feel like it's been answered when it kind of hasn't been answered, right?
It's the art of politics where you're saying a lot of things.
And he's very well.
You're saying a lot of things without saying much, right?
Yeah. Yeah. So I think through the interview, when you hear like a lot of people's criticisms of it, it was that Tucker Carlson went pretty soft on Putin. And for a lot of people that did tune in, especially from a Western audience, it was with view to really drilling down on the conflict in Ukraine, right? And I think this is where it comes to a couple of really interesting points. A lot of pundits have called this a podcast rather than an interview, right? And why the nuance is important is because, I don't know, like what interviews like for politicians have you like seen that are like over 2 hours? Like I don't like, not that I've seen a lot of political interviews, but 2 hours for an interview seems on the longer side, right?
Yeah.
It seems on the longer side.
What? For example, there was talk apparently that Biden was supposed to have an interview with like one of the major TV networks, but then he backed off because of the recent heat that he's been getting about, you know, not being of the right state of mind and age to be able to articulate stuff. Yeah. It's like you think about those type of interviews, or what immediately comes to mind for some reason is like the 60-minute style interview where it feels very pointed. Obviously it ends up getting edited and posted in a way that, you know, really highlights some particular things. Yeah. But it's a very like not a rapid fire, but it would feel like a grilling of sorts, right?
I think the 60 minutes analogy is pretty spot on. And the criticism that he really received was from mainstream journalists. Obviously, there's probably a level of jealousy because all these major news outlets would love to have this interview, and no doubt they've asked. But secondly, I think the reason this is important is because if you think of the 60 minutes style of interview, you're coming in and it's basically one element of topic that's going bang, 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 right? So people
with
were
a little
hoping,
bit of fluffy like in between, but then otherwise it's overall like...
People were hoping for this adversarial sort of nature that for Tucker to go in that hard to Putin, right? Of which I say one of two things. One is,
do you want to die?
Like, please know who you're speaking with. And secondly, I think that's the main thing. Secondly, Tucker was trying to have like an intellectual debate with him here. And like there's some certain elements that I'll raise which kind of led me to believe there. But I think the style of a Joe Rogan or the style of a long form podcast means that you
Sorry, I have to interject there. The fact that Joe Rogan is synonymous with podcast really freaks me out. Yeah.
Is that you transition to different topics, right? Yeah. And a lot of that some of that is preconceived. And he literally had a piece of paper there, which means that he had some sort of set questions. Yeah. But a lot of it, and like this is how I had to, through 2 hours, this is the flow of the conversation. Russian history and context, Ukraine tensions, neo-Nazi emphasis, Nord Stream, chats about energy, the American dollar, relationship with China, Russia being a Christian leader in Russia. Does Putin see spirituality in the world? The development of AI and Elon Musk's contribution. And there's another one that I'm just not gonna, but like
it's well rounded actually when the amount of topics.
But when
you can't really, without having watched this, right? But if I was Tucker, it'd kind of be like, it sounds like he was trying to get some level of questioning about Russia, Ukraine, couldn't get it. And therefore, like, you got to expand.
Maybe pivoted to other,
which is very synonymous with like a podcast sort of format. But here's what makes it just confusing. So Tucker has his like lower thirds and branding and emblem there. It's literally written Tucker Carlson interview. And I think this is the disconnect that a lot of people were getting. And maybe the podcast interview thing is a minutia, whichever way you want to think about it. It is an interview of sorts. But Putin was able to really artfully dodge a lot of questions, which I think led to Tucker Carlson basically transitioning to a different sort of form. And I think a lot of people kind of felt like it's very hard to get this guy being interviewed by a Western. Yeah.
Also, probably to add to that, it's because it's his editorial stamp at the end
Correct.
of the day, right? It's not as if it's like what is it, NBC or news or whatever it is, right? So
Yeah, was he on CNBC before he got let go? Like where was?
What's the other one?
Where's Tucker Carlson?
It's the one with the red logo. The one that's synonymous for like Republican kind of
Fox News.
That's the one.
Yeah.
It says he was a CNN commentator.
And CNN,
Yeah.
Well, CNN's a bit more
neutral. I was trying to type quickly and I typed Tucker Carlson.
Yeah.
So I thought that was really sort of interesting. But another thing, like you're talking to Vladimir Putin, right? You know who you're talking with behind, right? There's got to be some level of respect to who you're talking about, and you're in Russia. You're literally
in their
sitting
land.
in the Kremlin.
It's read the room. It's understand the rumors that surround this guy, and it's just respect the
especially given
place.
recent news about Alexei Navalny.
Yeah.
He's passed away.
Crazy. It's come straight after too.
Yeah.
Yep.
Well, passed away.
Yep.
Yes.
Yeah.
But in my view, not knowing the full context of it, and I'm sure there's a lot of like theories and things around the internet. I think he really did try his best, right? But it evolved, the interview, the podcast, whatever you want to call it, evolved in such a way that made it very challenging for him to go back and really probe there. Much less, I think he wanted Putin to speak. And I think, interestingly enough, after this interview, Putin was interviewed by, Russian journalists. And he said that he actually thought that he was expecting a much harsher interview from Tucker Carlson.
Yeah.
Which is ironic, and it's easy to say in hindsight. And he actually said that he was prepared for it. And again, just based on how, I don't know the word, how smooth Putin was with his transition in questions and stuff like that. And he's a very accomplished operator, right? Like in that there were some very pointy questions that Tucker was asking him. And at no time did he feel overly pressured to present an answer really quickly. And I say this because in a lot of times there were pauses. They were like literally thinking dynamically on the fly and coming with an answer, which leads me to believe that it was a very sort of organic interview or an organic conversation. And I think as a good interviewer, a good podcaster, you've got to read the room, right? Like Putin is, to me, is akin to like an A+ fencer, right? Like you're trying to nail this guy, but he's just deflecting it very well. And
It's
like
all on the wrist.
extremely, extremely well, to the point that you're like, okay, you know what? I can go make this dirty and I can just go back. Why are you avoiding this? Like, sorry, this is not. And he did versions of that, albeit very nuanced and very like civil. Let's call it civil.
Yeah.
But this is what Putin's apparently known for. Like he provides answers, like you said, very a politician, and he provides answers that probably don't get into it, but gives you enough that you felt like it's been answered, right?
Yeah.
And I think, interestingly enough, just to kind of conclude this, the part that I don't think is getting a lot of like airplay with a lot of like media sort of pundits was the fact that in the interview, and this is the last question, amongst the last questions that Tucker Carlson asks, he actually tried to negotiate the release of Evan Zhirosky. That's probably a wrong pronunciation of the word, of the name. But basically, this is a guy who's apparently been seen as a spy, and he was caught in Russia. Apparently, he's a really young sort of bloke, and for like business trading or something like that. And he was literally trying to say that, hey, look, this guy, he's not even a spy in the truest sense, not working for CIA and all that. Like whatever he did that. Why don't you try and release that? And I thought that if you're nailing a guy, i.e. Tucker Carlson, for not going hard in, it's a pretty ballsy thing to do and then like interview and nail it there. And as impressive as I thought that was, I thought it was just, again, very impressive how Putin was able to parry it off. And he basically said that, yeah, I'm not going to be able to articulate it very well, but he effectively said that it's not like, regardless of what delineation of spy and all that, be it like at the highest level or lower level.
There's still some level of
There's
threat.
some level of that. It's being negotiated between the two countries.
Yeah.
And we've got to let this play out its course. And I'm not saying, and this is me paraphrasing what Putin's saying, that he's not going to come back to the US. That is an option on board. But again, like it's a very, like, I just marvel at the way he's able to just, we're talking about human life, not negotiating, but talking about that he's able to use words in such a cool and calm sort of manner. And I think it was just befitting of the whole sort of interview. I just found it really fascinating.
It's all I can think of for some reason, it's like, Tucker Carlson, multi-hyphenate, like,
Put on his LinkedIn.
Journalist, media personality, the negotiator.
The negotiator.
Add that to the lower third.
Yeah.
And this was the last bit, right? So after Putin answered that question, Tucker basically ended it, right? In the sense that he literally said, "Thank you, Mr. Putin," right? "Thank you for the interview." And then after Putin said, so the last question, the last conversation that they had was about trying to get the release of this hostage, right? And then Putin said, "I just want you to know that in operations like this between two countries, the US and Russia, we've got to make sure that this is communicated in a cool and calm manner." And then I told you this, literally when he said that, and this is after he said, "Thank you, Putin," to end it.
Yeah.
Tucker just like loses it. And you have to go.
He went into rage
You have
mode.
to, no, and I'm saying that as a hyperbole, but if you go back to this point, his demeanor, he goes like, wait, hold up, right? Because he's pulling on the word cool and calm, right?
Yeah.
I can't help think that in the same way that you're talking about that, we could have a similar conversation or a peace negotiation between the war between Russia and Ukraine. And that's just interesting because he's ended it. And this is the point that I was saying. He was trying to intellectually find a way to go back to each point in conversation, but to try and go back to the Russia and Ukraine situation, of which America is highly involved in there. But he just could not find any openings. It probably slipped away through. And even after he's concluded it, after he saw a little bit of an opening, he says like, I gotcha. This is my moment. And again, he was able to brush it off and basically say that we are ready to negotiate. It's on the table of Ukraine and the US. But yeah, it's actually a really fascinating interview.
This was before the time, but it's very much like, in overtime and the Super Bowl game and feeling like the Chiefs because they got the try at the end of whatever it's called, whatever it's called.
Bonus
at the
content.
End of,
Bonus content.
At the end of it, right? Because it's like, I got you.
20 minutes. And in true Putin form, he ended the interview. So I can't remember what he said, but how he kind of paraphrased it and articulated it. No. It was really poetic, right? He was actually talking about, like, remember how I was saying that he was communicating to Tucker. And I think this is another thing, right? Like, we can see the war through our glasses, and any war is terrible, right? Because there's casualties on both sides. But he was articulating like basically a scene between Ukrainian and Russian fighters, right? And he was saying that these Russian fighters had basically got the Ukrainian soldiers cornered. And the Russian soldiers were saying, "Hey guys, don't fire back and you're going to live," right? Obviously they're still going to get captured as prisoners, but you're going to live. And the Ukrainian fighters say, "We're not going to do that because Russians never surrender," right? And the reason he's saying that is because he's saying that there is a strong affiliation of being Russian within strong factions of, not factions, but a strong percentage of the Ukrainian population. And he basically said this is akin to like a civil war, which means that the conversations that you're having and that they're much more deeper than you know. And I think that in that 30 to 40 minute diatribe that he was trying to have, he was trying to explain something which is inherently a lot more complex than we possibly know. And there's no doubt that the US guys know versions of this, right? Like they know it. Then you can't,
you can't go
fuel
in there
a war not knowing any elements of that. There's scholars of history that operate on both sides. But I think there's one thing knowing it and one thing living it. Because when that story gets told, it really speaks to shit, man, this is a lot more multifaceted if you have people that are fighting, like Ukrainians fighting against Russians and saying stuff like this. Now, I say this is assuming I believe what he says is true, right? He could be lying. Propaganda is a real thing. Like, it's a very, and at that story, he kind of ended it and said, he's like, the church, and he was saying basically that the soul of Russia kind of lives on, or that's a real element in this war. And then he went to Tucker, I think this is a nice place to end, don't you think?
Yeah.
And that's what I'm saying, dude. That's boss ass shit.
That's some judo like freaking magic where you're like,
dude, that is like,
we are done.
Jedi mind tricks.
He's basically.
That's what I was trying to say. Jeez.
When I want this to end, I will end. However, the tenure of this interview, I want it. He was basically in control of it the whole entire time. And unless you are outright adversarial, and maybe it goes into like not a yelling match, but like he's not going to yell, like a really grimy match, which I'd be intrigued to see, which I don't think you'd probably get an interview with him. He's going to win in a lot of these exchanges. And I think Tucker, lived to fight another day, because there's no doubt he wants another one. I mean, 17 million carry.
Yeah, best out of 3.
Round 2.
Anyway,
Fight.
Interesting interviews. Check it out.
Yeah.
If you've got 2 hours and 7 minutes to spare.
Yep. Set aside some time.